really none of your business. It's none of my business.
Bonsoir and welcome to the Motivated Classroom August Spotlight, where we are focusing on 31 interviews in 31 days from the last 4 years of interviews on the Motivated Classroom. And today is a whopper episode. This was an episode that I think just didn't change me, my teaching, and how I look at acquisition and learning of languages, but I think it kind of propelled the podcast to new heights. So firstly, a massive thank you to Karen Rowan for organising it as part of the CI reboot. But this was the first kind of big double episode with two people at once, and it was with Dr. Karen Lichtman and Dr. Bill VanPatten, two huge names in the language acquisition field. And it was episode 50. And there were so many amazing things from this episode. Like, just to give you some context, I have 7 pages of notes, which I'm not going to read through all of them, but even trying to pick out a few quotes from it is really difficult because it was just full of so much interesting and amazing stuff, especially someone like Bill VanPatten, who he's written so much and researched so much over such a long time in this area and is so well respected in the field. It was incredible to hear him speak about things so frankly. So just a few things. First of all, I think this is a great little follow-up to Dr. Krashen's episode, which I did in yesterday's Spotlight, which was episode 83. Because I started off by talking to them about Krashen's work and the fact that it has been criticised, and you know there are many academics who criticise it heavily, and how they felt about that, because of course the whole purpose of this episode was me talking to them about their research paper 40 years after Krashen. Was he right? And basically their conclusion is yes. And so Bill VanPatten started by saying, I was around in the days when Krashen's ideas were being debated. I remember when Krashen was literally vilified and people said horrible and nasty things about him. I felt that the vilification and the scaremongering against him was unjustified. I wanted to get people to understand that you really don't do second language acquisition today in any field or any subfield of it without somehow being traced back to Steve ideas in one way or another. And now, of course, Krashen was actually putting ideas together from other people too. They're not all his ideas were original to him, and he'll be the first to say that, but he brought them together in a package. The takeaway from me for teachers is that you hear things like Krashen is old news or Krashen is being disproven. Well, the answer is no, that's not quite true. So I want to go back and take a look with more open eyes, not just hearsay. And I thought that was like really, really powerful way to begin the episode. And then, of course, Karen Lichtman followed that up by saying, I think some teachers, especially in the CI community, still think, Krashen is great, everything Krashen says is the best, and it's true. Those people run the risk of looking sort of out of date. And then other people think like, oh no, Krashen's being discredited, like we don't talk about Krashen anymore. And that's not true either. The truth is, what Krashen said was exactly right. And now we talk about it using new, updated terminology. So sort of a combination of those two is where we want teachers to be and what we want them to know. I thought that was really, really powerful as well. And then you had Bill VanPatten coming back saying, if he was to give some advice to Krashen back in 1978, he wouldn't call them hypotheses, he'd call them statements. They're facts in need of explanation. So if you look at what those are now, they are literally undisputed in the 2020s. One is the fundamental role of input in acquisition, which is the foundation of the input hypothesis. The acquisition-learning distinction is now widely accepted. Essentially, the distinction between implicit and explicit knowledge and implicit and explicit learning. And what's interesting is, if you look at the psychological literature now, in terms of non-language and other language studies, people are doing it from that perspective. It's overwhelmingly now coming to the consensus that learning language is largely implicit. So the fact that something 40 years ago may have looked less than solid doesn't mean that they are now. Again, like really, really powerful. And it goes on to kind of categorically state that Krashen's input hypothesis that we acquire language through input that is understandable and by going to the next bit after that is a fact. Like there's no one who disputes that really. Like no one says that you can learn or acquire language without comprehensible input. You need to have it. Like that's widely accepted. And he says other things like, these are facts. They're just facts. So the idea is you have facts that are in need of explanation. So explanation is one thing, facts is another. But we have moved on the idea that it's a hypothesis. And then Karen Lichtman said, I think what we're dealing with here is a very abstract thing that learners are building up in their heads. some of it seems like it might be unfalsifiable because it's just so abstract and complex. It's hard to have that very concrete, direct evidence, but that doesn't mean that the theory is wrong. And I think that's one of the core things from this interview was just language acquisition is so complex and difficult that no matter how hard we try to explain it and break it into teachable chunks, we really can't. We just have to go with the one thing we know, which is we acquire it through inputs that are understandable and interesting to us. And Bill VanPatten gave the lovely, analogy of the atom and the fact that 1,000 years ago, they thought the atom was this tiny little particle and that was proposed. And then over 1,000 years of studies and research and evidence, we can now call it a fact, that these tiny little particles. And that's where we're going with this, is that he proposed something 40 years ago and it's been evidenced and it's been researched. And now more and more people are just coming out saying, yeah, we just need to call this as a fact, that we acquire language through comprehensible input. And then there was the interesting part about explicit instruction. And now I think it's important here we say this is in relation to language acquisition. We're not talking about the learning of facts like in, a science class or in a humanities class or a geography class. We're talking about language acquisition. And he's saying that the research on explicit learning and the interface stuff is overstated and overblown. And he goes very carefully in about it. And he says, the Norris and Ortega famous study from the year 2000. But they basically show that explicit grammar instruction has a positive effect. But both of the researchers here, Karen Lichtman and Bill VanPatten, were categorically saying like, yes, of course it does on explicit grammar tests. Like if you're trying to do better on a fill the gaps grammar exercise test or your knowledge of specific grammar, then yes, of course, teaching with a very explicit grammar based facts, teaching it like a mathematical science or whatever, that is, of course, going to have a big positive impact, obviously. But did it have any impact on communication or fluency or proficiency? Probably not. And Karen Lichtman says, I think the obvious answer to why we're still clinging to this kind of idea of teaching grammar first is that we became language teachers and we're the people who loved the grammar exercises. Upwards of 99% of people don't become language teachers. And, she's basically making the point that we just loved it. We nerded out about it. We liked getting stuff right and we worked at it. But actually, Bill VanPatten then says, but the reason we became fluent was probably not what happened in those classes. It was us interacting with the language on trips abroad, marrying someone, going out with someone, being in a football team or something with people and interacting with them and speaking the language and listening to it because we were motivated to do so. And then there's a huge part about beliefs, and Bill VanPatten carefully says, that we all need to question our assumptions. And then I really like the bit about interaction, because this is often what happens. People say, okay, I understand the role of comprehensible input, but surely we can't just do comprehensible input. We need interaction. It's a classroom. And as a classroom teacher, I would definitely say that that's true from a motivation and competence perspective, that we need students to be able to interact in the class in the target language, particularly around co-created activities, to make them feel like they can do it. But again, Bill VanPatten says the research on interaction and its effect on acquisition is overstated and overblown. And there are actually, if you sit down and talk to people who do research on interaction, if you really push them, they'll tell you the limited effects that it has on acquisition. Michael Long's original interaction hypothesis in 1981 was that interaction gets you is more comprehensible input. So the interaction helps you to get modified language so that you as a language learner can then use it as if that wasn't part of the interaction first. So essentially, like if you think about my daughter, she's 2 now, and she does a huge amount of interaction with me because she's trying to learn language. So she'll say things like, instead of, she's learning French as well at the same time. So she say something like, my pas sit down. So she's trying to say, I won't sit down, or I don't want to sit down. So pas from French and my as the I. And then I might say something back to her like, okay, you don't have to sit down, but I'd really like you to sit down. So she's just getting more comprehensible input of the word sit down, sit down. And eventually she'll hear me saying it, saying like, I'm sitting down, I like sitting down, I'm going to sit down. So that interaction with her is getting her more input. And that's essentially what the interaction does in the second language acquisition class too. And then finally, I thought Karen's takeaway was lovely, that fluency, we need to concentrate more on fluency. She says, fluency is my new way to convince reluctant teachers that we need to teach in a more comprehension-based way. Because if you ask them, are they happy with how fluent their students are? They're going to say no. And then when you say, oh, I tried this novel or I did this movie talk, and because we did so much discussion and co-creation, the students got really fluent with it. And they could really talk about it with no notes or not even have to think about it. And then that's going to really get people on, oh, really? Tell me more about this. Because that is often what we're missing is the fluency. And then I think the last part about forced output in the class, this goes back to the interaction thing from Bill VanPatten, was really nice. Because we're talking about, is interaction important, and do we still need it in a classroom setting? And again, from a motivation perspective, I say yes. But he breaks it down really nicely. He says, so it's a broad question. If somehow you're engaging with someone who can't speak, you better be prepared to rush in and help them so they save face. Otherwise, you're engaging in demotivation. So what he means there is you're asking questions in class to someone and they don't understand and they suddenly lose face, like, oh, I can't do this. You better be willing to rush in. So that's different than someone who raises a hand and tries to say something in the language or just blurts it out on their own. If you've got students doing that, then what teacher in their right mind would ever stop that? If you're in a committed class, you would never stop a student just blurting something out in the target language or raising their hand. And that's that, what's it called again? The agentic engagement by the researcher John Marshall Reeve, when the students are so involved in the learning that they're trying to drive it forward. And that's what happens in co-creation of stories and of invisible characters. And then Karen finishes it all together by saying, what we really need to be doing, and Bill talks about this a lot, is talking with the students, not at the students. And I think I'll bring it together there. It was a fantastic episode. That is by far the longest August Spotlight so far. Please go back before the start of your school year and listen to episode 50 with Karen Lichtman and Bill VanPatten. It is a 5-star, amazing episode. Highly recommend it to everyone, that 45-50 minutes of your time. Hasta mañana. See you tomorrow. Gur mil mahagaf agus slán